Hey guys, tonight we are going to travel back to a time when medicine was, well, a little more personal than you might expect. We're journeying to an era where the most respected doctors, the wealthiest nobles, and even kings and queens looked for healing not in a lab's synthesized pill, but in something far older, far stranger, and frankly, a little bit gruesome. It's a world where the line between medicine and cannibalism got incredibly blurry. So yes, a gentle warning. If you were suddenly transported back there with your modern sensibilities, you might just politely refuse your treatment and, well, probably not make it through the week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's your support that keeps these late-night journeys into the weird corners of history going. And while you're at it, I'd love to see where you're all listening from. Go ahead and drop your city and the current time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see our little community of night owls spread across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you'll be aware of is the cold. Not a crisp, refreshing cold, but a deep, damp chill that seems to emanate from the very stone walls of your bedchamber, seeping through the thick woolen blankets and into your bones. It's been weeks. The cough started as a tickle, a minor annoyance in the smog-filled London air, but now it's a rattling, cavernous thing that shakes your whole body and leaves you breathless and weak. The fever comes and goes in waves, leaving your sheets soaked and your mind adrift in a hazy fog. You've tried everything. The local apothecary sold you bitter herbal tinctures that made your eyes water. You've had poultices of mustard and onion plastered to your chest, smelling so strongly you thought you might be pickled from the outside in. Nothing has worked. The world outside your sweat-fogged window, the clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestones, the distant cry of a street vendor feels a million miles away. Today, however, is different. Today, the specialist is coming. He isn't just any physician, he is a man of learning, a fellow of the Royal College, a doctor who tends to lords and wealthy merchants. His fee is extortionate, but at this point your family is willing to pay anything. He arrives not with a flurry, but with a quiet, imposing gravity. His black coat is immaculate, his white lace cuffs pristine. He doesn't smile. He simply observes you with intelligent, dispassionate eyes, his presence filling the small, dim room. He takes your wrist, his fingers cool and dry, not to feel your pulse in the way a modern doctor would, but to assess the quality of your blood. He listens to your chest, his ear pressed against a silk handkerchief, and nods slowly. He speaks in low, measured tones about the humors. Your body, he explains, is out of balance. Your phlegm is in excess, your vital heat is diminished. This is the mainstream historical knowledge of the day, the Galenic theory of medicine that has dominated European thought for over 1,000 years. It's not quackery, it's the absolute pinnacle of scientific understanding. He doesn't offer you another foul-smelling herbal brew. Instead, he reaches into his leather satchel and produces a small, heavy packet, neatly folded from thick, expensive paper and sealed with a dab of wax. This, he says, his voice barely a whisper, is mumia. The word hangs in the air, exotic and mysterious. He explains that it is a substance of immense power, sourced from the ancient lands of Egypt. It is made from the preserved bodies of their pharaohs and nobles, men and women who lived in a golden age and were embalmed with rare spices and mystical resins, their bodies imbued with a powerful, enduring life force. Consuming this, he assures you, will restore your body's natural balance and rekindle your dimming vital flame. As he describes it, you notice a peculiar detail. He leans in, conspiratorially, and tells you this isn't just any mumia. There is a debate, you see, he murmurs, one that my colleagues in the academies of Padua and Paris are still fiercely arguing. Some believe the most potent mumia comes from bodies preserved with natural bitumen, the substance the Persians call others, like myself, hold that true power lies in bodies naturally desiccated by the hot desert zones, their essence concentrated over centuries. He taps the packet. This is the latter. Far rarer, far more potent. This is their version of a fierce scientific dispute, not if you should eat a dead person, but which kind of dead person provides the best results? And here is a truly strange little fact. He stresses that its efficacy is also tied to the status of the deceased. The mummy of a king is naturally more powerful than that of a courtier. A virgin princess, he implies, offers a purity that an old soldier simply cannot. It's a pharmacology of social hierarchy. He gives you precise instructions. A pinch of the dark, granular powder, the size of a pea, to be dissolved in a glass of warmed wine and taken just before you sleep. He collects his fee, gives a stiff, formal bow, and is gone, leaving you alone in the deepening twilight. You hold the small packet in your palm. It feels heavier than it should. The room is silent now, save for the sputtering cans and the ragged sound of your own breathing. All your hope, your future, your very life, is apparently contained in this dusty, powdered remnant of a long-dead Egyptian. You break the wax seal and unfold the paper. The powder within is dark brown, almost black, with a strange, dry, spicy scent, mingled with something else, the smell of dust, of age, of the tomb. You mix the dark powder into the warmed wine. It doesn't dissolve completely, creating a murky, swirling liquid that clings to the sides of the goblet. Bringing it to your lips, you hesitate for only a moment before taking a swallow. The taste is confusing. It's earthy and bitter, a strange cocktail of sensations. There's the warmth of the wine, the faint sweetness of grape, but underneath it all is that dry, dusty flavor like licking an ancient stone under lingering aftertaste of spices you can't quite name. Myrrh, perhaps. Cassia. It's not unpleasant, just profoundly, deeply strange. You drain the cup, leaving at the bottom, and lie back against the pillows, the doctor's words echoing in your mind, from the ancient lands of Egypt to lands of Egypt. As the warmth of the wine spreads through your limbs and the strange medicine begins its work, let your mind drift down the Nile, back through the centuries, to the origin of this whole bizarre business. Because what you just drank is the result of one of the greatest, most long-lasting misunderstandings in medical history. It all started not with mummies, but with a substance, a naturally occurring black, sticky mineral pitch, a form of asphalt or bitumen. In the ancient world, especially in Persia, this stuff was called mum, and for thousands of years, this was a legitimate and widely used medicine. The great Greek and Roman physicians, like Diacorsized and Pliny, wrote about it. It was used as a sealant for wounds, a salve for rashes, an antifungal remedy, and even taken internally for stomach complaints. It was a staple of the medicine cabinet, a known and trusted remedy traded across the ancient world. The most famous source for this medicinal bitumen was the Dead Sea, but it's used from the ground in other parts of the Middle East as well. And here's a little known fact: the quality varied wildly depending on the source. Physicians would debate the merits of bitumen from different regions, much like a modern connoisseur discusses the terroir of wine. Some was prized for its purity, some for its particular mineral content. It was a serious, if somewhat messy, business. So where do the Egyptian dead fit into all of this? Simple, really. When Arab conquerors and scholars entered Egypt centuries later, they saw the bodies wrapped in linen and coated in a dark, black, resinous goo to preserve them. Seeing this black, tar-like substance, they used the word they already knew for it. It looked like bitumen. They felt like bitumen, so it must be bitumen. The Latin-speaking European scholars who later read these Arabic texts translated it into their own language, and mum became mumia. At first, the logic was simple enough. We need the medicine known as mumia. The Egyptians have slathered their dead in it. Therefore, we can scrape it off the mummies and use it. It was a harvesting technique, not a form of cannibalism. The body was just the container for the valuable black goo. But here, my friend, is where the story takes a sharp turn into the bizarre, a turn that historians are still trying to pinpoint the exact moment of. When did the container become the content? When did people stop scraping the bitumen off the mummy and just decide to grind up the whole thing, bones, dried flesh, linen wraps, and all? The shift was likely gradual, born of a potent mix of greed, magical thinking, and bad science. Perhaps the genuine bitumen supply was dwindling or too expensive, so merchants began to pass off the entire embalmed body part as the genuine article. More likely, a new, More potent idea began to take hold. The thinking evolved. This wasn't just any bitumen, it was bitumen that had been sanctified, that had rested formal enia within the sacred confines of a tomb. It had been mixed with other exotic balm, cedar oil, frankincense, myrrh, and most importantly, it had absorbed the very essence, the life force of the person it was preserving. Suddenly, the goal wasn't to get the mineral. The goal was to get the person. The idea was that by consuming the remains of a powerful, healthy Egyptian who had lived a vibrant life thousands of years ago, you could absorb their vitality. You weren't just taking an antiseptic, you were performing a kind of physical transfusion of life force across the ages. The misunderstanding was now complete. A simple geological substance had been forgotten, replaced by a far more powerful and far more marketable idea, the idea that you could literally eat your way back to health by consuming the ancient dead. Lying in your bed, a strange peace settling over you, you can almost imagine it. The spirit of some long-forgotten Egyptian noble, their strength and longevity, dissolving in wine, now flowing through your veins, fighting the sickness in your lungs. It's a powerful, comforting thought. And all over Europe, thousands of others just like you were thinking it too. The next morning you wake up feeling well, not miraculously cured, but perhaps a little lighter. The cough is still there, but the rattling seems less severe. The fever has broken, leaving behind a clammy exhaustion. Was it the mummy? Or just the course of the illness? It doesn't matter. Hope is a more potent drug than any powder, and for the first time in weeks you feel a flicker of it. The treatment is to continue. But where does this strange medicine actually come from? Let's take a little trip. Not to your doctor's refined study, but to a place far more common, far more essential to the life of the city. We're going to the apothecary's shop. You push open a heavy oak door, a small bell tinkling overhead, and step into a world of overwhelming smells. The air is thick with 1,000 competing aromas. The sweet, heavy scent of dried lavender and rose petals hangs in the air, mingling with the sharp, clean smell of camphor and the spicy notes of cinnamon and clove. Bunches of dried herbs, chamomile, yarrow, sage hang from the rafters like rustic chandeliers. The only light coming from a grimy window and a few flickering candles that cast long, dancing shadows across the shelves. Behind a long wooden counter stands the apothecary. He is not a doctor, but he's a master of his craft, a respected member of his guild. His hands are stained with potions and powders, his fingernails permanently edged with grime. He nods at you, his eyes shrewd, and asks what you need. The shelves behind him are a library of earthly remedies. You see large glass jars filled with leeches, swimming lazily in murky water. There are drawers meticulously labeled in Latin: radix, glias, trias auri for licorice root, floras and thymidis for chamomile flowers. This is the standard pharmacopoeia of the era, the legitimate, everyday business of healing. You can buy purgatives, sleeping draughts, bombs for burns, and tonics for weak nerves. But you're here for something special. You present the folded paper from your doctor, and the apothecary gives a knowing look. He doesn't retrieve your prescription from the public-facing shelves. Instead, he turns and disappears through a curtained doorway into the back room, his sanctum sanctima. Let's follow him. This is where the real secrets are kept. The air back here is different, less floral, more earthy and intense. This is the workshop. A large bronze mortar and pestle sits on a heavy table, stained with the residue of countless ground ingredients. A small furnace glows in the corner, with distillation equipment, alembics and retorts of glass and copper gleaming in the firelight. And on a set of shelves, away from prying eyes, is the special stock. Here, things get weird. You see jars containing powdered crab's eyes, believed to be good for the stomach. There's a box of toadstones, supposedly magical gems, found in the heads of toads, that act as an antidote to poison. You might even spot a horn from a narwhal, sold at an astronomical price as a genuine unicorn horn, guaranteed to purify any liquid it touches. And then you see it. On a low, sturdy shelf, a collection of objects that look like they belong in a museum of horrors. There is a human skull, yellowed with age, sitting next to a neat pile of what looks like dark, brittle wood but is, in fact, pieces of a human hand. There are large clay jars labeled simply Mimir. One might be specified as Mimir get Piaka, while another, cheaper one, might just say Mimir. This is the apothecary's dirty little secret and his most profitable product line. The demand for Mimir is so high that a thriving, complex, and often fraudulent supply chain has sprung up to meet it. The most expensive, top-shelf Mimir is, supposedly, genuine imported Egyptian mummy. Merchants with contacts in Cairo or Alexandria would bribe or conspire with local tomb raiders. The mummies or pieces of them would be broken up, packed into crates, and shipped across the Mediterranean, passing through the great trading hubs of Venice or Genoa before making their way to apothecaries in London, Paris, and Amsterdam. But let's be honest, the supply of pharaohs is limited. This leads to a fascinating and ghoulish counterfeit market. Here's a weird little detail that apothecaries had to watch out for. Some unscrupulous traders in Alexandria would take the bodies of recently deceased criminals or beggars, fill them with cheap bitumen, and bake them in the sun until they were hard and brittle. They'd then pass these fakes off as ancient remains. An experienced apothecary claimed he could tell the difference by the smell and taste. A genuine ancient mummy had a distinct, not unpleasant aroma of myrrh and spices. The fake just smelled of tar. The apothecary returns to the main shop, carrying a small scoop filled with the dark, brownish powder. He weighs it carefully on a small brass scale, his movements practiced and precise. The cost is high, enough to feed a poor family for a week. As he wraps it for you, you might ask him, as many did, about its provenance. Is it a noble? A priest? He'll likely give you a vague but reassuring answer. A person of significance, he might say, from a very old tomb. This is a world where historians are still debating the scale of this trade. How much of the mumia sold in European apothecaries was genuine, and how much was a local or contemporary fabrication? The paper trail is murky, filled with coded language and deliberate obfuscation. But one thing is certain: for centuries, the back rooms of these respectable shops were repositories for the dead, their shelves a silent testament to one of history's most bizarre medical manias. You take your packet, pay the man, and step back out into the street, clutching your strange, expensive, and deeply personal dose of medicine. Clutching the small paper packet, you hurry home through the bustling, muddy streets. The city is a chaotic symphony of life: the shouts of vendors, the rumble of iron-shod wheels, the sharp tang of coal smoke and unwashed humanity. But your mind is focused on the little pouch in your hand. It feels both sacred and profane, a tangible link to a world of pyramids, pharaohs, and mystical healing. Back in the quiet of your room, you prepare the nightly ritual. This time, as you mix the powder into the wine, you look closer. You see the texture of it, a fine grit of pulverized bone, dried tissue, and what you imagine to be ancient, fragrant resins. The doctor's words about absorbing the life force of the long-dead echo in your ears. What does it actually mean to consume a person, even one who has been dead for 3,000 years? As you raise the goblet, let's pause and consider what you are about to taste. Forget the romantic notions of pharaohs for a moment and think about the reality. You are, in essence, about to drink a ground-up, desiccated human being. You are swallowing history, quite literally, quite literally. The experience is not just medicinal, it's an act of magical thinking so profound it borders on the spiritual. You take the first sip. The familiar, unsettling taste fills your mouth, earthy, a bit salty, with that strange, spicy undertone. It's the flavor of the tomb, of dust and time. This is the moment where the abstract theory of humoral medicine becomes incredibly, physically real. You are not just rebalancing your humors with a neutral substance, you are introducing a powerful, external human essence into your own body, hoping it will overpower the sickness within you. The belief system that underpins this act is potent. You've been told that these ancient Egyptians possessed a secret to longevity. Their monumental tombs and incredibly preserved bodies were proof of it. They didn't decay like normal folk. Therefore, by consuming a part of them, you are participating in their immortality. It's a desperate, hopeful syllogism. They cheated death. I am eating them. Therefore, I can cheat death. This is the core psychological engine driving the whole phenomenon. A powerful desire to overcome human frailty by consuming those who seem to have transcended it. Let's talk about the specific product you're consuming, mumia. As we've established, it's a catch-all term. But within that, there were different grades and qualities like olive oil today. The most prized, the extra virgin of the mummy world, was mumia from bodies that were not embalmed with bitumen, but were naturally preserved by the dry desert heat. These were thought to be pure, their life essence less contaminated by artificial substances. Finding one of these was the jackpot. A truly bizarre piece of trivia from the era comes from the writings of the great French surgeon Ambroise Paré, who was a skeptic. He described how these mummy prospectors or mummiologists would travel deep into the Egyptian desert, guided by locals to ancient burial grounds. They would enter crumbling tombs by candlelight, their senses assaulted by the dry, close air and the smell of immense age. They would break open sarcophagus and select the best preserved bodies, those that were light, dry, and almost brittle. They would then saw them into pieces right there in the tomb, packing heads, limbs, and torsos into sacks to be smuggled back to the coast. It was a grim, industrial process, a production line of the dead. But what if you couldn't afford the imported stuff? Your local apothecary would have a cheaper domestic alternative. This might be the arm of an executed thief, or the skull of a soldier who died on a nearby battlefield, dried in the apothecaries of an unpulverized in his mortar. The label wouldn't say local thief powder, of course. It would still be sold under the exotic and respectable name mumia. Historians still debate how much the average consumer knew about the true origin of their medicine. Did they genuinely believe they were consuming a pharaoh, or was there a kind of collective suspension of disbelief? Was mumia just a brand name by this point, with everyone tacitly understanding that it might just be the guy who was hanged at Tiban last month? The answer is likely a bit of both. But the underlying principle that consuming human remains was good for you was widely accepted, regardless of the source's passport. As you finish your cup of murky wine, you feel a strange sense of connection. You are now part of a vast, invisible communion of patients across Europe, all placing their faith in the desiccated flesh of the dead. You have ingested a story, a myth, a desperate hope ground into powder. You are no longer just you are you, plus a tiny ancient, anonymous piece of someone else. You lie back, close your eyes, and wait for the magic to work, for the strength of a pyramid builder to knit your lungs back together, one dusty particle at a time. The days turn into a week, and the week into two. Slowly, tentatively, you begin to feel stronger. The cough recedes into a memory, the fever is gone, and color returns to your cheeks. You can sit by the window now, watching the world come back to life, feeling the weak sunlight on your face. Was it the mumia? Your doctor would say yes, unequivocally. Your family is convinced. You, yourself, are inclined to believe it. In an age without antibiotics, any recovery from a serious illness feels like a miracle, and miracles need a source. But why? What was the logical framework that made eating a dead person seem like a pinnacle of medical science? It feels like sheer madness to us, but for them it was based on a complex and internally consistent system of thought. It wasn't just eat this, feel better. It was a science. Let's try to understand the operating system of their world. For over 1500 years, European medicine was dominated by the teachings of Galen, a Greek physician who lived in the Roman Empire. The core of his theory, and the mainstream medical knowledge of your time, was the doctrine of the four humours. This idea proposed that the human body was composed of four fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humour was linked to an element: air, water, fire, earth, and equality: hot, cold, wet, dry. A healthy person was someone whose four humours were in perfect balance. Sickness was, quite simply, an imbalance. Too much phlegm, cold and wet, caused a cough or a cold. Too much yellow bile, hot and dry, made you choleric and irritable. The goal of any medical treatment was to restore that delicate equilibrium. This is why doctors practiced bloodletting. If you had a fever and excess of hot blood, the logical thing to do was to remove some of it. It's why they prescribed diets if you had a cold ailment. You were told to eat hot foods like pepper and ginger. Now, where does eating a mummy fit into this elegant system? This is where it gets a bit more esoteric, blending medicine with a dose of what we might call magical thinking. The principle was called similia simili busca and tur, or like cures like. but it was a very specific interpretation of like. The idea was that you could treat a part of your body by consuming the same part from another creature. But a headache. The brain of a fox might help. Weak kidneys. Try the kidneys. When you apply this logic to humans, it takes on a whole new level of potency. A human is the pinnacle of creation, so their parts must be the most powerful. But the real genius, the real selling point of Mumia, was its perceived quality. The ancient Egyptians were seen as masters of preservation. Their bodies, steeped in exotic balms and spices like myrrh and balsam, were thought to be perfectly tempered or balsamic. They weren't hot or cold in a destructive way, they were perfectly balanced, imbued with a substance that halted decay. Decay was the ultimate sign of humoral imbalance. Therefore, a substance that stopped decay must be the ultimate balancing agent. Consuming Mumia was like giving your own unbalanced body a potent dose of perfect, preserved equilibrium. It was thought to be a universal remedy, a panacea, because it didn't just target one humor, it helped to harmonize the whole system. And here's a weirdly specific detail of the theory: the life force, or spiritus, was thought to be most concentrated in the blood and flesh. However, fresh blood and flesh were considered too hot and volatile. The genius of a mummy was that this life force had been aged, matured, and stabilized over thousands of years. It was potent but not dangerous. It was like the difference between drinking raw grape juice and a fine, aged wine of medicinal cannibalism. However, this is where a fascinating scholarly debate of the era raged. While the Galenists focused on the mummy as a source of balsam to balance the humors, a new school of thought was emerging, led by the revolutionary and controversial figure of Paracelsus. He and his followers had a different take. They believed that the body was a chemical system, a microcosm of the universe. For them, Mumia wasn't about humors, it was about an essential life principle, an archeus, that could be extracted. They weren't interested in the crude powder, they wanted to distill the quintessence of the mummy. So you had two competing scientific justifications for the same practice. One doctor might tell you the Mumia powder will soothe your overly moist phlegmatic humor. Another, more modern thinking alchemical physician might claim he's providing you with the distilled vital spirit of the ancient dead. The end result was the same: you ate the mummy. The why was just a matter of which scientific camp you belong to. So your recovery isn't just a fluke. It is proof in your world that the system works. By ingesting the balanced, preserved flesh of an ancient Egyptian, you have restored your own internal harmony. It is logical. It is the height of modern medicine. And feeling as good as you do, who are you to argue? Now that you're feeling better, you're back in society. You're attending dinners, going to the theatre late. And you find that your recent, rather exotic, cure is not a shameful secret to be hidden, but a topic of polite and even fashionable conversation. When you mention to a wealthy merchant's wife that your recovery is thanks to a course of the finest Egyptian Mumia, she doesn't recoil in horror. She nods knowingly and tells you about the time her husband took it for his gout, or how her cousin swears by it for her persistent melancholia. You quickly learn that you are in very, very good company. This isn't some fringe folk remedy practiced by peasants in forgotten villages. This is the medicine of the rich, the powerful, and the royal. For centuries, the most prominent figures in Europe were not just users, but connoisseurs and advocates of corpse medicine. Let's start at the top. Picture the glittering court of King Francis I of France, the great Renaissance monarch, patron of Leonardo da Vinci. Whenever he left his palace, whether for a hunt or a military campaign, he never went without his personal pouch. It didn't contain gold or state secrets. It contained a mixture of mimea and ground rhubarb, his personal go-to remedy for any ailment, from a simple fall to a battle wound. He considered it his ultimate first aid kit. Cross the channel to England. King Charles II, the merry monarch who ruled during the Restoration, wasn't just a consumer, he was a producer. He was a keen amateur chemist and had his own private laboratory at Whitehall. One of his most prized possessions was a recipe for a medical tincture that he had purchased for the immense sum of £6,000 th, the primary ingredient. Human skull. He would personally oversee the distillation process, creating what became famously known as the King's Drops. This potent brew of skull alcohol and other ingredients was his personal panacea, which he would dispense to courtiers and visiting dignitaries suffering from ailments like epilepsy or vertigo. He even took a dose on his deathbed, though sadly, it failed to work its magic that time. The belief was so ingrained that it became a part of statecraft and diplomacy. When Pope Innocent II was lying gravely ill in 1492, his physician, according to some chronicles, attempted a radical and horrifying procedure. He allegedly took the blood of 3 healthy young boys, hoping to transfuse their vitality directly into the ailing pontiff. The Pope and the boys all died, while the veracity of this specific story is debated by some historians. The fact that it was recorded and considered plausible tells you everything you need to know about the mindset of the time. And this wasn't just a masculine pursuit. Queen Elizabeth I's court physicians recommended Mumia. Dr. John Dee, her famous advisor and mystic, was a believer. In Denmark, King Christian IV's court physicians prescribed it. The practice was endemic across the royal houses of Europe. It was a status symbol. To be able to afford genuine, high-quality Mumia was a sign of immense wealth and sophistication. It was the 17th century equivalent of having a personal trainer and a diet of exclusive, imported superfoods. Now for a truly strange little anecdote that shows how commonplace this was. The great English philosopher and scientist, Sir Francis Bacon, a man who helped lay the foundations of the scientific method, calmly and matter-of-factly recommended Mumia for staunching blood flow. Robert Boyle, another founding father of modern chemistry, also kept pulverized human skull in his medical supplies, believing it could cure headaches and neurological disorders. These weren't superstitious old fools, they were the greatest minds of their generation. And here lies a point of ongoing historical discussion: why were the elite so particularly drawn to this? Some argue it was about power. By consuming the remains of ancient kings, or so they thought, modern rulers were performing a symbolic act of absorbing their predecessors' majesty and authority. Others suggest it was simply a matter of access. Only the very wealthy could afford the imported article and the expensive physicians who prescribed it. A peasant with a cough got a mustard plaster, a duke got powdered fairer. It was the ultimate expression of a class-based medical system. So as you sip your wine at a lavish dinner party and discuss the merits of Egyptian versus Persian Mumia with a countess, you realize you're not just sharing a medical tip. You're participating in a ritual of power. You are part of an exclusive club, one whose members believe they have access to the most potent, most ancient, and most exclusive medicine in the world, the very substance of kings. Your personal supply of the precious powder is starting to run low. It's become a comfort, a part of your daily routine, not for any specific ailment now, but as a general tonic, a preventative measure to keep your humors in check. You return to the apothecary, expecting to purchase another packet with ease. But this time he frowns. His stock of the finest Egyptian Mumia, he explains, is gone. A new shipment was expected in the port of London, but it has been delayed, or perhaps seized by customs officials in Italy. The price, he laments, is going to skyrocket. This is a scenario playing out all over Europe. The demand for ancient Egyptian mummies, fueled by centuries of medical belief, has become voracious. It has created a supply and demand crisis of the most ghoulish kind. The tombs of the pharaohs in the Nile Valley, which had lain mostly undisturbed for millennia, were now the targets of an industrial-scale resource extraction operation. And that resource was running out. Think of it as a gold rush, but for the dead. For centuries, local Egyptian guides and entrepreneurs had made a tidy living leading European merchants. The trade was, for a long time, a trickle. But by the 16th and 17th centuries, that trickle had become a flood. Tombs that were once sealed and sacred were being dynamited open. Necropolises like Sakava became vast, open-pit mines. Mummies were dismembered, sorted, and packed into crates like so much salted fish, their limbs and torsos becoming a commodity on the international market. The Egyptian authorities, first under the Mamluks and later the Ottomans, were aware of this. They periodically tried to ban the export, not out of any particular respect for their pharaonic ancestors, but because it was an unregulated trade that they weren't getting a sufficient cut of. These bans, however, were about as effective as most prohibitions. They simply drove the trade underground, making it more dangerous and more lucrative for smugglers. A fascinating detail from this period is the emergence of a mummy tourist culture. Wealthy Europeans on their grand tour would often visit Egypt, and a popular, if macabre, souvenir was a piece of a mummy, a hand, a foot, or even a whole head. The travelogues of the time are filled with casual descriptions of travelers exploring tombs by torchlight, unwrapping a mummy just for the thrill of it, and pocketing a few shriveled fingers as a keepsake. This casual desecration was happening alongside the commercial harvesting for the apothecary trade. The supply was finite. There are only so many high priests, so many sacred cats and devices. Yes, animal mummies were also ground up for medicine, though considered less potent. As the most accessible tombs were plundered unemptied, the price of genuine Egyptian mumia in the apothecaries of Europe climbed ever higher. Nature and commerce abhors a vacuum. When the demand for a product far outstrips the supply, one of two things happens: you find a new source, or you create a substitute. In the case of corpse medicine, they did both. The mummy trade, which had for so long been focused on the exotic and ancient, now turned its gaze inward. It began to look for a local, more sustainable source of raw materials. And this is where the story takes an even darker turn. If you can't get a 3,000-year-old Egyptian, perhaps a recently deceased local will do. A new domestic industry began to spring up, one that was fresher, cheaper, and far more gruesome. The focus shifted from the ancient dead to the recent dead. This wasn't about dusty tombs and mystical resins anymore. This was about the gallows, the poorhouse, and the battlefield. This shift created a fierce debate among physicians and apothecaries of the time. Was this new mumia as good as the old stuff? Proponents argued it was even better. Why use a dusty, dried-out old body when you could have a fresh one, its vital spirit still potent and vibrant? They argued that the spiritus of a strong young man, tragically cut down in his prime, was far more medicinally active than that of someone who had been dead for millennia. Opponents, the purists, were horrified. They claimed these new preparations lacked the essential balsamic quality of true Egyptian mumia. They were just dead bodies. They argued it was a disgusting fraud. But the market had spoken. The demand was too high, the profits too great. The apothecary who turned his nose up at using the local recently deceased would simply lose business to the less scrupulous competitor down the street. The era of the fresh European mummy was about to begin. And the suppliers for this new market wouldn't be tomb raiders in a distant land. They would be the city's own executioners, grave robbers, and poorhouse officials. The supply chain was about to get a whole lot shorter. The apothecary, seeing the disappointment on your face, leans over the counter conspiratorially. The Egyptian may be scarce, he whispers, but one must move with the times. I have something. Fresher, more vigorous, some physicians claim. He gives you a sly wink, locally sought. You don't need to ask what he means. Everyone knows. As the supply of genuine Egyptian mummies dwindled, a grim and efficient domestic industry had risen to take its place. Europe began to manufacture its own mumia, not through the ancient arts of embalming, but through a brutal, pragmatic process of harvesting the unwanted dead. The romance of the pharaohs was replaced by the grim reality of the gallows. The main suppliers for this new trade were the executioners. The hangman, a figure of terror and revulsion in society, suddenly found himself in a uniquely profitable position. He had legal and unrestricted access to a steady supply of fresh, healthy corpses, the bodies of executed criminals. In many cities across Europe, the executioner's perks included the right to the condemned's body. What was once a burden to be disposed of now became a valuable commodity. After a public hanging, the executioner and his assistants would take down the body and transport it to a workshop, a place no citizen would willingly go. Here, a grisly form of butchery would take place. The body was a collection of valuable parts, each with its own specific medicinal use and market price. The skull was the most valuable, destined to be dried and powdered. The fat would be rendered down into a valuable ointment. Even the blood might have been collected at the scene. Let's follow the journey of one of these unfortunate souls, a young man hanged for theft at Tyburn Gallows in London. As soon as he is cut down, his body is not given a Christian burial. It is claimed by the hangman and taken to a shed. Here, under the flickering light of a tallow candle, the processing begins. The The goal is to create a product that mimics the appearance of aged Egyptian mumia. The body might be eviscerated and the cavity stuffed with a mixture of salt, spices, and bitumen to simulate the embalming process. Then, it would be left to cure, often by hanging it in the sun or placing it in a low-temperature oven, until it was hard, dry, and brittle. The result was a grotesque parody of an Egyptian mummy, ready to be broken up and sold to the less discerning apothecaries. But executioners weren't the only suppliers. Another key source was the battlefield. After a major battle, the field would be littered with thousands of dead soldiers, mostly men. For the local peasants, this was a grim but lucrative harvesting opportunity. They would strip the bodies not only of clothes and valuables, but also of usable parts, which could be sold to traveling merchants or apothecaries. A particularly ghoulish detail comes from the aftermath of the Battle of Waterloo. So many bones were collected from the field by opportunistic locals that 4 years afterward, a major English bone processing company used them to produce fertilizer. It's highly likely that many of these same bones also found their way into the medicinal trade. And then there were the grave robbers, the infamous resurrection men. While they are most famous for supplying bodies to anatomy schools in the 18th and 19th centuries, their trade existed long before that, feeding the insatiable demand from apothecaries. They would prowl cemeteries at night, digging up the freshly buried to sell them, piece by piece, to the back alley medical market. The bodies of the poor and the friendless were particularly vulnerable, as their graves were less likely tended or visited. This is where a fascinating and unresolved historical question arises. How did society tolerate this? In a deeply religious Christian Europe, the sanctity of the body and the importance of a proper burial for resurrection were paramount. Yet, at the same time, a vast, semi-legal industry based on the desecration and consumption of those same bodies thrived. Historians suggest a kind of cognitive dissonance was at play. The bodies being used were those of the criminal, the enemy soldier, the pauper. They were dehumanized, their bodies seen as forfeit. A respectable citizen could consume a powder made from a hanged murderer's skull without feeling that they were compromising their own future resurrection, because the murderer's soul, and therefore body, was already considered damned. The apothecary, seeing your hesitation, tries to reassure you. This, he says, holding up a new, slightly less dusty packet, is from a young, strong specimen. The vital spirits are at their peak, far more potent for building up one's constitution than some dusty old Egyptian. His sales pitch is a perfect summary of the new medical rationale: fresher is better, vitality is key. The age and mystique of the pharaohs had been replaced by the raw, immediate power of the recently living. You are no longer consuming ancient magic, you are consuming raw, unadulterated life force harvested from the fringes of your own society. The question is, do you still want it? You stand there in the apothecary shop, the sounds of the street outside muffled and distant. You're weighing the apothecarious words, a new kind of unease settling in your stomach. The idea of consuming an ancient, anonymous Egyptian was one thing. It was abstract, historical, almost mythical. The idea of consuming a local man, someone who might have walked these same streets last month, that feels different, more visceral. More real. How is it made? You ask, your voice barely a whisper. The apothecary, perhaps sensing a sale slipping away, decides a little trade craft education is in order. He wants to demystify the process, to present it as a clean, scientific, and logical procedure, not the ghoulish butchery it truly is. It is a refined art, he begins, adopting a professorial tone. One does not simply grind up a body. It must be prepared, purified, to render it a proper medicine. So, let's peek behind the curtain and learn the art of preparing a medicinal mummy, European style, based on the recipes and manuals of the time. This isn't just speculation. Physicians and alchemists wrote this stuff down. Step 1: sourcing the raw material. As we've established, quality is paramount. The ideal specimen, according to a 16th century recipe attributed to the great Paracelsus, is the corpse of a man in his early 20s, red-haired, who has died of iron, breaking on the wheel or sword. Why red-haired? This is one of those bizarre, specific details. Some alchemical theories link the color red to vitality and the element of fire. Why a violent death? The belief was that, in a sudden death, The vital spirit or life force didn't have time to dissipate. It remained trapped within the flesh, making the corpse medicinally potent. A man who died slowly of disease was useless, his vitality was already gone. Step to the initial preparation. Once you have your prime specimen, the body must be kept in the open air for a day and a night, under a clear sky, preferably with a full moon. This wasn't for decomposition, it was for cosmic alignment. The body was thought to absorb certain celestial energies that would enhance its medicinal properties. This step perfectly illustrates the blend of pragmatism and pure magic that defined the practice. Step 3. The pickling process. Now for the messy part. The recipe instructs you to cut the flesh into small pieces. Then, you are to sprinkle it with a powder made of myrrh and a bit of aloe. After this, you must soak the pieces of flesh in spirit of wine or high-proof alcohol for several days. This served a dual purpose. On a practical level, the alcohol acted as a preservative and disinfectant. On a mystical level, the spirit of the wine was thought to draw out and merge with the spirit of the flesh, creating a potent spiritual chemical cocktail. Step for the curing. After soaking, the pieces of flesh are removed from the alcohol and hung up to dry in a cool, dark, airy place. This is a slow curing process, similar to making prosciutto or jerky. The goal is to desiccate the flesh completely until it is hard, dark, and has lost all its watery, corruptible elements. It should be hard as wooden. If prepared correctly, should have a spicy, not unpleasant, aroma from the myrrh and wine. This finished product is your mummy, ready to be powdered. This recipe highlights a key intellectual conflict of the era. Historians are still untangling this thread: how much of this was genuine belief in celestial rays and vital spirits, and how much was a kind of pre-scientific food preservation technology being dressed up in mystical language to make it more palatable and mysterious. Was the apothecary a magician, or was he just a butcher with a better vocabulary? The apothecary, of course, omits the more gruesome details. He doesn't mention the red-haired man or the breaking wheel. He simply speaks of purification with fine spirits and curing with rare spices. He presents it as a craft, a skill, like a vintner talking about his grapes. He wants you to see the final product, the dry, innocuous powder, and forget the horrific process that led to it. You look at the packet he's offering you. It's no longer just a medicine. It's the end result of a dark and terrible alchemy. It is the story of a violent death, of a desecrated body, of a belief system that could transform a human being into a raw material. The thought is deeply unsettling. But then, a cold draft from the shop door reminds you of the chill you felt in your bones just a few weeks ago, the rattle in your chest, the fear of death. The memory is a powerful motivator. With a sigh of resignation, you slide the coins across the counter. You leave the apothecary shop with your small, grim purchase, your mind buzzing with the strange realities of this new local medicine. It's one thing to have a general tonic made from the whole body, but your doctor, during a follow-up visit, suggests something more specific for the lingering headaches and fogginess you've been experiencing since your illness. He explains in his calm, authoritative voice that for ailments of the head, one must use the head. The principle of simile a stimilibus curanti ui cures like in its most direct and literal form. He recommends a preparation of powdered human skull. This wasn't some niche fringe idea. The use of the human skull, or cranium humanum, was one of the most widespread and respected forms of corpse medicine in Europe, lasting well into the 18th century. It was considered a specific and powerful remedy for all things related to the head: epilepsy, seizures, vertigo, headaches, and general neurological complaints. The logic was simple and compelling to the premodern mind. The skull is the container of the brain, the seat of the soul and the rational mind. Therefore, its substance must contain a powerful essence that can restore order to a troubled mind. The source of the skulls was, as you might expect, the same as for the fresh mumia. The skulls of executed criminals were particularly prized. However, there was a hierarchy of skulls, a kind of connoisseurship that physicians would debate endlessly. The skull of a young man was considered more potent than that of an old one. But the absolute peak, the grand CRU of medicinal skulls, was that of a man who had died a sudden violent death without being buried. left to bleach in the sun and rain, was cleansed of its fleshy, corruptible parts, leaving only the pure, essential bony matter. This led to a truly bizarre and specific micro-industry, the harvesting of skulls from gibbets and execution grounds. In Ireland and parts of England, the skulls of hanged men left to rot on display were sought after. But there was another, even more specific source: the battlefields of old. It was believed that the skull of a soldier, slain in battle and left on the field, was a potent medicine. And this brings us to one of the strangest little sub-remedies in the pharmacopoeia of the dead skull moss. As these unburied skulls to the elements, a type of moss, often of the genus Usney, would sometimes begin to grow on them. This moss, called Muscus ex cranio humana, moss from a human skull, became an incredibly valuable and sought-after ingredient in its own right. It was thought to have absorbed the vital spirits that lingered in the bone, concentrating them into a powerful new form. The moss was scraped from the skulls, dried and powdered. It was primarily used not for headaches, but as a stypticase substance to stop bleeding. The logic was pure magical association. The skull came from a man who died violently, likely shedding much blood. Therefore, a substance grown from that skull must contain the spirit of congealed or stopped blood. A 17th century recipe for a sympathetic powder for treating wounds at a distance, a whole other level of weird we'll get to later, called for the moss from the skull of a man who has been hanged and broken on the wheel. It was believed that if you applied this powder to the weapon that caused the wound itself would heal, no matter how far away the patient was. The debate among the learned men of the time was, of course, not is it weird to use moss growing on a dead man's head, but which moss is better? Is the moss from a skull of a hanged man superior to the moss from a soldier's skull? Does the age of the skull matter? Does the type of moss make a difference? These were the questions that filled the pages of medical and alchemical texts. The great chemist Robert Boyle, a pioneer of the scientific method, seriously recorded a recipe for a styptic that involved the powder of the skull of a man killed by a violent death. Back in your drawing room, you look at the new powder your apothecary has procured for you. It's finer and paler than the dark mumia powder, almost white. It's been prescribed to be taken in a tincture, dissolved in alcohol, a few drops on the tongue each morning. It has almost no taste or smell. It is the sterile, refined essence of what was once the protective vessel of a human consciousness. You think of the man it came from: a thief, a soldier, a rebel. You think of his last moments, the violent end that made his remains so medicinally valuable. And you wonder if his spirit, his memories, his own long-forgotten headaches, are now swirling in the little vial you hold in your hand. Your regimen of powdered skull seems to be working, or at least you've convinced yourself it is. The morning fogginess lifts a little quicker, the dull ache behind your eyes less persistent. During a conversation with an elderly aunt who has come to visit, you mention this new treatment. She nods sagely, but then leans in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The skull is good, my dear," she says, "but the real power, the old magic, is in the Usney." She's talking about the moss, Muscus ex cranio humano, skull moss. While the skull itself was a mainstream, if expensive, remedy, the moss that grew upon it occupied a slightly different space. It was more esoteric, more deeply steeped in folklore and what we would call sympathetic magic. For many, especially those outside the formal physician's office, this was where the real potency lay. Let's delve into the strange world of this graveyard botany. The plant in question, most often identified as Usney barbata or beard moss, is a type of lichen that hangs from trees in long, stringy tendrils looking like an old man's beard. It grows all over the world, but for medicinal purposes its provenance was everything. Moss from a tree was just moss, but the exact same species of moss, when harvested from the bleached skull of a man who had died violently, was transformed into one of the most magical substances in the apothecary's cabinet. The core belief here was one of transference. The moss growing directly on the bone was thought to act like a sponge, soaking up the last vestiges of the soul or spiritus that lingered in the skull. This spirit, having been violently expelled from the body, was considered particularly potent and astral. The moss didn't just contain the man's life, as it contained the very essence of his violent demise. Its primary use was as a powerful styptic to stop bleeding, especially nosebleed. A common method was to take a pinch of the powdered moss and simply insert it into the bleeding nostril. The effect was often immediate and impressive, which, of course, only reinforced the belief in its power. We now know that many lichens, including arsenic acid, a compound that has genuine antibiotic a compound that has genuine antibiotic and vasoconstrictive properties. So in a happy accident of folklore and biochemistry, this particular remedy actually worked, albeit not for the reasons they thought. But the most famous application of skull moss was in the creation of the Jungen Tamar Mariam, or the weapon self. This was the pinnacle of sympathetic magic. The theory was this: if you were wounded by a sword, you did not treat the wound, you treated the sword. Here's how it worked. You would take the weapon that caused the injury, clean it, and then anoint it with a special ointment. A key ingredient in this ointment was, you guessed it, moss from a human skull. Other ingredients might include human fat, earthworms, and boiled pig's brain, all mixed together into a lovely paste. You would then wrap the sword in a clean linen cloth and keep it in a cool, dark place, taking care to re-anoint it daily. Were simply instructed to keep their wound clean and covered. Miraculously, the wound would often heal. To the 17th century mind, this was proof of a powerful, invisible sympathy acting across a distance. The salve on the sword was magically healing the wound. To our minds, it's obvious what was happening for the first time. A wound was being left alone. Instead of being packed with dung, cobwebs, or other foul materials as was common practice, it was simply kept clean. The magic was basic hygiene. The elaborate ritual with the sword was a brilliant, if accidental, placebo that prevented people from doing more harm to themselves. This practice led to some of the most heated and vitriolic scholarly debates of the age. Figures of the burgeoning scientific revolution were trying to make sense of it. Did it work? If so, how? The famous Flemish chemist Jan Baptist van Helmont was a believer, arguing it was proof of a universal magnetic force. Others, like the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher, tried to debunk it, arguing it was the work of the devil. The debate wasn't about the ghoulishness of the ingredients, but about the physics of the magic. Historians are still fascinated by this debate because it represents a crucial moment of transition, where thinkers were grappling with concepts like action at a distance, which would later be central to Newton's theory of gravity, but they were doing so in a world still thick with magic, skulls, and moss. And here's a truly bizarre piece of trivia: the trade in skull moss was so specific that merchants would distinguish between moss from the skulls of men and those of women, and even the location on the skull from which it was scraped. Moss from the top of the skull was considered different from moss from the jaw. Each was believed to have a slightly different virtue. Your aunt, a woman of practical folk wisdom, might not know the scientific debates, but she knows the stories. She knows that a pinch of that grey-green powder can stop a bleeding nose in its tracks. She tells you where you might find some not at the main apothecary, but from a wise woman on the edge of town, someone who deals in older, earthier remedies. It's a medicine that exists in the twilight between science and superstition, a tiny plant that carries the full, strange weight of their world's beliefs about life, death, and the invisible threads that bind them together. Your interest is piqued. While the official medicine of doctors and apothecaries is one thing, this world of wise women and ancient folk remedies feels like another layer of this strange reality. But before you go seeking out moss gatherers, your attention is pulled back to the world of high society and royal medicine. You hear whispers at a dinner party about the late King Charles I and his famous personal remedy, a concoction so prized it was known simply as the King's Drops. It wasn't just a medicine he took, it was a medicine he made. This wasn't a king simply consuming a product prepared by others. Charles I was a passionate amateur scientist, a natural philosopher in the language of the day. He had a private laboratory built for him at Whitehall Palace, complete with furnaces, alembics, and all the paraphernalia of 17th century chemistry and alchemy. And his pet project, his signature creation, was a tincture made from human skulls. Let's imagine you get a rare invitation to the palace, not for a ball, but for a glimpse into the king's private world. You're led down a quiet corridor, away from the tapestries and gilded furniture, to a heavy oak door. The air here smells different, sharp with the tang of alcohol and strange chemical reactions. Inside, it looks less like a royal chamber and more like an alchemist's dream. Glass vessels of all shapes and sizes line the shelves. A fire roars in a specially constructed hearth. In the center of it all is the king himself, his fine lace cuffs pushed back, a smudge of soot on his cheek, personally tending to a bubbling retort. The recipe for the king's drops was a closely guarded secret, which he had purchased from a physician named Jonathan Goddard for the staggering sum of £6,000, enough to buy a large country estate. While the exact formulation was proprietary, the primary ingredient was no secret at all: cranium humanum. The king would source the best skulls he could find, often Irish skulls, as they had a reputation for being particularly potent, likely due to the soil composition where they were buried. The process was one of distillation. The skull would be shattered and pulverized into a coarse powder. This powder would then be mixed with other ingredients, perhaps dried viper hearts or ambergris, and placed into a retort with high-proof alcohol or spirit of wine. The mixture would then be gently heated for days. The alcohol vapor would rise, carrying with it the volatile essence or spirit of the skull, before condensing in a cool tub and dripping into a collection flask. Clear liquid was the prize, the distilled soul of the skull, a pure, potent, and incredibly expensive medicine. This was cutting-edge science for the time. Distillation was seen as a way of purifying a substance, of separating its coarse, earthly body from its fine, ethereal spirit. Charles wasn't just making a crude powder, he was creating a refined, alchemical quintessence. He was a perfect embodiment of his era, a monarch who straddled the old world of magical belief, the power of skulls, and the new world of scientific inquiry, the process of chemical distillation. A weird but telling detail: the king's drops became incredibly fashionable. To be offered a dose from the king's own hand was a sign of immense royal favor. Courtiers would famous wound or a headache just for the chance to receive it. It was used for everything from epilepsy to a general pick-me-up. The poet John Wilmot, Earl of Rochester, a famous wit and drake at Charles's court, likely partook of it many times. The remedy became so famous that after the king's death, the recipe was sold and marketed commercially. For decades, you could buy bottled Goddard's drops, advertised as the former secret remedy of the king, a testament to its enduring fame. This royal hobby, however, sits at the center of a fascinating historical debate about the nature of science and monarchy in the 17th century. Was Charles's laboratory work a genuine pursuit of knowledge, or was it a form of political theater? Some historians argue that by mastering the secrets of nature, the king was reinforcing his own image as a master of the state, a ruler with divine and hidden knowledge. His ability to create this potent mixture from the base matter of a skull was a metaphor for his ability to govern and bring order to the kingdom. Others see it as a more personal obsession, a genuine intellectual curiosity typical of the age, where a king could be as fascinated by the chemistry of a skull as he was by the intricacies of a treaty. As you stand in the imaginary doorway of his lab, watching the king carefully adjust a flame, you see the ultimate expression of this medical tradition. It's not a desperate act by a sick commoner. It's a passion project for a king. The skull is not a grim reminder of death, but a source of power, a raw material to be transformed through knowledge and fire into a life-giving spirit. The king's drops were more than a medicine, they were a symbol of absolute power. The belief that even the secrets of life and death could be bottled, if you were a king. The king's drops, distilled in the quiet of a royal laboratory, represent the most refined, elite version of corpse medicine. But as you move back out into the cacophony of the city, you're reminded that for every elegant, distilled remedy, there was a raw, brutal, and immediate counterpart. Not everyone could wait for a skull to be powdered and tinctured. For some ailments, and for some people, the cure had to be fresh, red, and warm. Let's take a walk to a place you would normally avoid at all costs, the public execution ground. In London it's Dibon, in Paris, the place to grieve. This isn't just a place of punishment, it's a theater of power, a public holiday, and for a certain subset of the population, an open-air clinic. The crowd is a chaotic mix of all social classes. Merchants, apprentices, housewives, beggars, and even nobles are turned out for the spectacle. The atmosphere is strangely festive with vendors selling pies and ale. But as the condemned man is led to the scaffold or the gallows, a different kind of anticipation builds among a small, specific group of people near the front. They aren't here for the thrill of the death itself. They are here for what comes immediately after. These people are the sick, the desperate. In particular, they are epileptics. For centuries, one of the most widely accepted cures for epilepsy, or the falling sickness, was the blood of a freshly killed man. The logic, in its own gruesome way, was direct. Epilepsy was seen as a failure of the vital spirits, a kind of internal chaos. The blood, considered the very vehicle of the soul and life force, was the ultimate source of these spirits. By drinking the blood of a strong, healthy man at the very moment his spirit was violently released, it was believed you could absorb that vitality directly into your own system, shocking it back into order. As the executioner does his work, and the condemned man's life ends, a strange ritual unfolds. An assistant to the executioner, or sometimes the hangman himself, will collect the still warm blood that flows from the body. Those who can afford it have paid the executioner a fee for this service. They press forward, holding out small cups or mugs. They receive their portion of the dark, steaming liquid and, without hesitation, drink it down right there, amidst the roar of the crowd. It is a shocking, visceral scene, but one that once has described how spectators at gladiatorial contests would rush into the arena to drink the blood of a slain fighter. This ancient belief persisted through the centuries, endorsed by respected physicians. The 16th century physician, alchemist Paracelsus, while critical of old-fashioned mumia, advocated for the use of fresh blood. He argued that it was a potent medicine for the restoration of the failing body. A particularly strange detail of this practice is the hierarchy of blood. Just as with skulls, not all blood was considered equal. The most potent blood was believed to come from a young, healthy man who had died. A violent man was considered particularly good. The blood of a beheaded man was considered particularly good, as the severing of the head was thought to release the vital spirits in a single powerful burst. The German physician Crolius, in his 1609 Basilicus Chymica, a standard medical textbook of its day, specified that the epileptic patient should be placed directly under the stream of blood as it gushes from the opened arteries of the executed person. The executioner therefore held a monopoly on this grim resource. He sold it by the cupful, and it wasn't cheap. It was a business, part of the dark economy that thrived on the fringes of the justice system. This practice forces us to confront a deep and troubling historical question. Where was the church in all of this? The Christian prohibition against consuming blood is ancient and profound, rooted in both the Old and New Testaments. The Eucharist, the symbolic drinking of Christ's blood, was a central sacrament. How could a society that held this ritual as sacred simultaneously condone the literal, physical drinking of human blood in the town square? Historians suggest a complex web of justifications. Some argue that the official church largely turned a blind eye, viewing it as a desperate folk practice beyond its control. Others point out that the blood being consumed was that of a sinner, a criminal whose body was already forfeited outside the normal bounds of sacred law. There was also a blurry line between medicine and magic. If a respected physician prescribed it as a cure, it could be rationalized as a medical necessity rather than a forbidden act of vampirism. It existed in a gray area, a space where the desperation of the sick overrode the deepest taboos of their faith. As you turn away from the grim scene at the scaffold, you are struck by the raw desperation you witnessed. This wasn't the measured, scientific ritual of the king's drops. This was medicine at its most primal. It was the belief that life could be stolen from the dying to be given to the living, enacted in real time, with a warm cup and a desperate swallow. It was the roaring, bleeding, immediate underbelly of the same system that had you delicately sipping powdered dust from a wine goblet. You've explored the refined world of distilled skulls and the raw horror of drinking blood at the scaffold. But there was another product to be harvested from the executioner's block, one that was less about internal consumption and more about external application. It was a substance that found its way into the medicine cabinets of rich and poor alike, a greasy, yellow-white commodity, with a grimly practical purpose: human fat. After the blood had been collected and the choice spots of the body claimed from a mumia or skull powder, The rest of the corpse was often rendered down, in a process grimly similar to rendering lard from a pig. The fatty tissues of the deceased were cut away and slowly heated in a large cauldron. The impurities would be skimmed off, leaving a clarified, semi-liquid fat that, when cooled, would solidify into a salve or ointment. This was known by many names across Europe and Germany. It was mentioned fat or arms under fat person as fat in France. GRAs say humane. To the English-speaking world, it was often just called hangman's salve. Unlike the more mystical remedies, the primary use for human fat was brutally pragmatic and based on observable, if misunderstood, effects. It was the go-to remedy for aches and pains. People would rub it on their joints to treat rheumatism and arthritis. Soldiers would use it to soothe sore muscles after a long march. It was applied to bruises, sprains, and even to the stumps of amputated limbs to ease pain and promote healing. The logic behind its use was a combination of like cures likened to more direct, physical reasoning. Fat was a softening, unpenetrating substance. Therefore, it could soothe hardened joints and penetrate deep into sore muscles. But there was a magical component too. The fat of a strong young man, especially one who died violently, was believed to contain his residual vitality and strength. By rubbing his fat into your aching limbs, you were thought to be absorbing his vigor, literally rubbing his strength into your own weak flesh. The executioner was, once again, the primary producer and merchant of this valuable ointment. He would sell it in small pots directly from his home or supply it to apothecaries, who would then repackage it, perhaps adding perfumes like lavender or rosemary to make it more pleasant to use. A weirdly specific detail is that the fat from different parts of the body was sometimes believed to have different properties. Fat from around the kidneys was considered particularly potent. The trade was so commonplace that in some German towns, the official town executioner was contractually obligated to render the bodies of the executed and supply the resulting fat to the local apothecary shops. It was part of his job description, alongside beheading criminals and torturing suspects. This turned him into a strange kind of civic functionary, a state-sanctioned manufacturer of medicine from the bodies of those the state had condemned. The use of human fat ointment was incredibly long-lasting, persisting in folk medicine well into the 19th century, long after powdered mummy had become a historical curiosity. This was likely because, to some extent, it worked. A fatty ointment of any kind provides a barrier on the skin and, when massaged in, can increase blood flow and soothe muscle pain. The effects were real, even if the vital spirit theory was not. This tangible result made it much harder to dismiss than the more abstract internal remedies. This practice also raises a complex historical question that scholars still explore. How did this trade interact with the rise of professional surgery? In this era, surgeons were seen as craftsmen, distinct from the more learned physicians. They dealt with the physical body, setting bones, amputating limbs, dressing wounds, and they often used ointments just like this. Did a respected surgeon knowingly buy his supplies from the hangman? The paper trail is often deliberately obscure. A surgeon's account book might list a payment for a zanai, a general term for fat or grease, without specifying its origin. It existed in a grey market, a don't ask, don't tell economy where a useful product's grim source was politely ignored for the sake of practicality. Imagine yourself in a bustling market square. You see a stall, not run by the fearsome executioner himself, but perhaps by his wife or an assistant. Next to jars of what might be honey or jam, there are small, unassuming ceramic pots sealed with wax. An old soldier with a limp hobbles up. He exchanges a few coins and walks away with one of the pots. A woman with gnarled, arthritic hands does the same. They are buying a simple, everyday remedy for their pain. They are also buying the rendered remains of a human being. You watch them go, realizing the sheer pervasiveness of this industry. It wasn't just about kings and epileptics. It was woven into the fabric of everyday life, and accepted, if slightly unsavory, part of the landscape of health and healing. The bodies of the dead weren't just for dramatic, life-saving interventions, they were for the mundane, chronic aches of being alive. You now have a fairly complete picture of this strange medical world. You've seen the why, the theory of humors and vital spirits. You've seen the what the powders, tinctures, blood, and fat. You've seen the who from kings to commoners, but as you sit in church on Sunday, the priest's voice echoing in the cabinet's stone building, a profound contradiction starts to gnaw at you. How does all of this square with faith? The sermon is about the resurrection of the body. The priest speaks of the last judgment, when the trumpets will sound and the dead shall rise from their graves, their bodies made whole and incorporate, to be reunited with their souls for eternity. This is a central, non-negotiable tenet of Christian doctrine. The physical body is not just a temporary vessel, it is sacred. It is destined for a glorious reunion with the soul. A proper burial, with the body intact, is essential for this final, miraculous event. And yet, yesterday you rubbed a salve made from a sinner's fat onto your aching shoulder. The man whose fat you used was not given a proper burial. His body was dismembered, sold, and scattered across the city in little pots and packets. How is he supposed to rise, whole and complete, on Judgment Day? And what about the countless people, yourself included, who have incorporated parts of other human beings into their own bodies? If you have consumed the dust of an Egyptian, is that dust now part of your body to be resurrected, or does it need to be returned to the original owner? This is a theological minefield, a direct clash between the most profound beliefs of your faith and the accepted medical practices of your society. How did they reconcile this? How could a person listen to a sermon on the sanctity of the body in the morning and take a dose of powdered skull in the afternoon without their head exploding from the cognitive dissonance? The justifications were complex and, to our minds, full of Kasuth's rigid, convenient loopholes. First, there was the dehumanization argument we've touched on. The bodies being used were often those who had been placed outside the normal bounds of Christian society. The executed criminal had, through his actions, forfeited his right to a sacred burial. His body was the property of the state, to be disposed of as it saw fit. The heathen Egyptian, having never been baptized, was already considered outside the flock. His ancient body more of a mineral or an artifact than a vessel for a Christian soul. The enemy soldier, killed in an unjust war, was similarly other-ed. By defining the source material as non-Christian or anti-Christian, one could sidestep the most troubling theological implications. Second, there was the power of God argument. This was a theological trump card. When confronted with the logistical nightmare of rear-smelling bodies that had been eaten, burned, or scattered, theologians would often fall back on the omnipotence of God. A popular saying, attributed to Street Augustine, was, "Do you think God, who could create you from nothing, cannot reassemble you from your parts?" The argument was that it's foolish for mortals to worry about the mechanics of resurrection. God is all-powerful. He'll figure it out. He can recall the particles of a body from wherever they have ended up, whether in the stomach of another person or the roots of a tree. This divine omnipotence provided a powerful and convenient release from having to think too hard about the consequences of your actions. Third, and perhaps most subtly, was the distinction between the crude matter and the spiritual form of the body. This is a deeply philosophical point that theologians and thinkers of the time debated intensely. Some argued that the resurrected body would not be made of the exact same physical particles that a person had at the moment of death, but would be a perfected version based on its essential form. Therefore, what happened to the crude, physical matter after death was theologically irrelevant. As long as the soul was in a state of grace, God would provide a new, glorious body for it. This line of reasoning allowed a person to view the corpse they were consuming not as a sacred vessel awaiting resurrection, but as mere crude matter that had been abandoned by its soul and its essential form. A strange but illustrative example of this theological tightrope walking can be found in the debates around relics. For centuries, the Church had venerated the body parts of saints. A finger bone of Street Peter or a vial of a martyr's blood were the most sacred objects in Christendom. How was this different from corpse medicine? Theologians drew a sharp line. Relics were objects of veneration, not consumption. They were conduits for divine power to be prayed to, not eaten, not beaten for personal health. They were sacred because of the holiness of the person they belonged to. The medicinal corpse was useful because of the physical or vital properties of the body, and its owner was often explicitly unholy. It was a fine distinction, but a crucial one for maintaining the integrity of their belief system. So as you sit in the pew, you are armed with these justifications. The man whose fat you used was a sinner. God is powerful enough to reassemble him anyway. And what you used was just his crude matter, not his sacred form. It all makes a strange kind of sense. The system holds. You can be a devout Christian and a user of corpse medicine. The theological gymnastics are complete, allowing faith and folk medicine to coexist in a state of uneasy, but functional, truth. Your uneasy truce with the theological implications holds, and life goes on. The remedies are a part of your world, as common as beer and bread. But one afternoon, while browsing a bookstore, you come across a pamphlet. It's crudely printed, the title bold and aggressive, The Unmasking of the Great Deceit, a warning against the violent cannibal ICKL practices of physic. The author is a physician you've vaguely heard of, a man with a reputation for being a troublemaker. As you read, you feel a growing sense of shock, not because the information is new, but because it's being presented with such righteous fury. The author doesn't just question the efficacy of mumia, he calls it what it is: cannibalism. He doesn't just doubt the power of hangman's salve, he calls it a ghoulish trade in human misery. He calls the learned doctors who prescribe it charlatans, and the apothecaries who sell it ghouls. You quickly realize that not everyone was on board with this whole corpse medicine enterprise. While it was mainstream, it was never universally accepted. From the very beginning, there were brave, often marginalized voices of dissent who dared to question the consensus. These were the skeptics, the contrarians, the men and women who looked at what everyone else was doing and said, "Wait a minute, this is insane." One of the earliest and most prominent critics was the great 16th century French surgeon Ambroise Paré. He's a towering figure in medical history, known as a father of modern surgery. He pioneered the use of ligatures to tie off arteries after amputations, replacing the brutal method of cauterizing the stump with a red-hot iron. He was a man of practical battlefield experience. He trusted what he saw with his own eyes more than what he read in ancient books. Paré was merciless in his criticism of mumia. He had traveled in Egypt and had seen the mummy factories firsthand. He wrote with disgust about how merchants would take the bodies of the poor, stuff them with bitumen, and bake them in ovens to pass them off as ancient pharaohs. He considered the entire trade to be a massive fraud. "It causes great pain to the stomach," he wrote, "a bad smell to the mouth, and a great and terrible vomiting, only a disgusting and harmful placebo." His rejection was based on observation and a healthy dose of common sense. Then there were the religious objectors, who weren't satisfied with the clever theological loopholes. A school of thought within the Reformation, particularly among some Anabaptist groups, took the idea of the sanctity of the body very seriously. They preached that all bodies, even those of sinners and heathens, were God's creation and should not be desecrated. To them, it wasn't a medical issue, it was a matter of blasphemy. The pamphlet in your hand seems to echo this sentiment, quoting scripture about the body as a temple for the Holy Spirit. A fascinating and little-known group of dissenters were the herbalists. In an age dominated by humoral theory and exotic, expensive remedies, the humble herbalist continued to practice a different kind of medicine, one based on local plants and traditional knowledge. Figures like Nicholas Culpeper in England wrote massive herbals for the common person, deliberately translating the Latin names of plants into plain English so that everyone could access the knowledge. They saw the trade in mumia and other human remains not just as gruesome, but as a form of medical elitism. Why pay a fortune for a piece of a dead Egyptian when a simple decoction of yarrow or comfrey, grown in your own garden, could work just as well for staunching blood or healing a wound? Theirs was a quiet, botanical rebellion against the expensive, ghoulish fads of the official medical establishment. However, the reasons for this skepticism are a subject of ongoing historical debate. Was it a true flicker of scientific rationalism, a rejection of magic in favor of empiricism, as the case of Paré might suggest? Or was it more of a competing paradigms issue? The herbalists weren't necessarily more scientific, they just had a different belief system, one rooted in the virtues of plants rather than the virtues of people. The radical Protestants weren't rejecting it on medical grounds, but on purely theological ones. The pamphlet you're reading seems to be a mix of all these things. It has the rationalist disgust of Paré, the religious fury of a reformist preacher, and the herbalist's plea to trust in the goodness of God's green earth rather than the wickedness of man's remains. But being a skeptic in this age was not easy. To speak out against a practice endorsed by kings, prescribed by the most learned physicians, and accepted by the vast majority of the populace was to risk your reputation, your livelihood, and even accusations of heresy. The author of the pamphlet is likely ridiculed by his colleagues at the College of Physicians. He's probably lost wealthy patients who prefer the exotic allure of mumia to his simple, boring remedies. You fold the pamphlet and slip it into your coat, feeling a strange mix of emotions. You feel a bit foolish for having been so easily taken in. You feel a flicker of admiration for the author's courage, but you also feel a deep-seated unease. If the most learned men in the kingdom are wrong about this, a practice so fundamental to their medicine, what else are they wrong about? The pamphlet hasn't just planted a seed of doubt about a single remedy, it has planted a seed of doubt about the very nature of authority and knowledge in your world. The solid ground of consensus you've been standing on suddenly feels a little less stable. The skeptical pamphlet has unsettled you. You start looking at the world with new eyes, questioning the things you once took for granted. The little pot of hangman's salve in your medicine chest now seems less like a remedy and more like a grim artifact. But just when you think you're ready to throw it all out, you discover that the journey of the dead doesn't always end in the apothecary's mortar and pestle. Sometimes it takes a detour into a completely different kind of workshop, the artist's studio. One day you're visiting the home of a wealthy merchant, a man with a taste for the finer things, including a growing collection of art. He proudly shows you his latest acquisition, a landscape painting by a promising young artist. You admire the rich, warm tones, the deep, luminous shadows in the forest, and a particular, beautiful translucent brown used to capture the glow of twilight on a riverbank. A marvelous color, is it not? The artist calls it mummy brown. You almost choke on your tea. Mummy brown? Yes. For several centuries from the 16th right up until the early 20th, one of the most popular pigments on the European artist's palette was made from the ground-up remains of Egyptian mummies. The very same mumia that was being sold as medicine was also being sold as a raw material for paint. The process was straightforward. An apothecary or a specialized colorman would take a whole mummy, or, more often, fragments of woman, grind it into a fine powder. This powder, which contained not just the desiccated flesh and bone but also the bitumen and resins used in the embalming process, was then mixed with a binder, typically linseed oil and varnish, to create a thick, oily paint. The resulting color was highly prized for its unique qualities. It was a rich, warm, resonant brown, somewhere between burnt umber and raw sienna, but with a transparency and depth that other pigments struggled to match. It was perfect for creating warm glazes, for deepening shadows, and for painting rich, flesh tones. It became a staple for artists, particularly during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Pre-Raphaelite painters in the 19th century were particularly fond of it for achieving their signature luminous jewel-like tones. So, as you walk through a gallery of old masters, there's a good chance you are looking at paintings created with the literal substance of ancient Egyptians. That shadowy background in a Rembrandt, the warm glaze on a portrait by Sir Joshua Reynolds, the rich, earthy tones in a landscape by John Constable. Any of them might contain a touch of mummy brown. Aber's aren't now famous anecdote till his practice came to a shocking end for some. In the mid-19th century, the British artist Edward Burne-Jones, a prominent member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, was at a gathering with some friends. A chemist casually mentioned the origin of the mummy brown pigment they all used. Burne-Jones was horrified. He had apparently never made the connection between the name of the color and its actual content. He rushed back to his studio, found his tube of mummy brown, and insisted on giving it a proper, solemn burial in his garden. He never used the color again. The use of this pigment raises a fascinating art historical question that is still being researched. How widespread was it really? And can we detect it now? It's a tricky problem. Because the pigment is a complex organic mixture bitumen, resin, fat, protein, it's very difficult to identify with certainty using standard chemical analysis. Unlike a simple mineral pigment like lead white, Its signature is messy and ambiguous. While museum curators and art conservators know from historical records that it was widely sold and used, definitively pointing to a specific brushstroke and saying that is a piece of a 2,000-year-old person is often impossible. The evidence is more textual than chemical. The supply chain for artists' mummies was the same as for medicinal ones. In fact, a mummy that was deemed unfit for medicinal use, perhaps it didn't smell right, or was broken into pieces too small for the apothecary trade, could be sold off to the color men. It was a way of using every part of the morbid buffalo, so to speak. This discovery adds another layer of profound strangeness to your world. The dead are not just being consumed for health, they are being used for beauty. Their ancient bodies are being transmuted not into life force, but into light and shadow on a canvas. The same substance that a doctor prescribes to heal your lungs is used by an artist to capture the ephemeral beauty of a sunset. You look at the merchant's painting again. The beautiful, deep brown of the riverbank no longer looks the same. You imagine the artist in his studio, squeezing it above the thick, oily paint onto his palette next to the bright reds and blues. You see the ancient dust of the Nile, the resins of the emblem, the very fabric of a long-dead person, being brushed onto a canvas to create an illusion of reality. The boundary between medicine, art magic, and sacrilege has become so blurry as to be meaningless. The dead are everywhere, not just inside you but hanging on the walls, for all to admire. Your journey has taken you from the sickbed to the artist's studio, revealing the hidden uses of the dead in your society. But where were these ideas being debated? Where were they being formalized and taught? The answer lies in the hallowed halls of Europe's oldest and most respected universities. This wasn't just a folk tradition or a back-alley trade, it was a subject of serious academic inquiry. Let's imagine you're a student at a prestigious university like Padua in Italy, or Leiden in the Netherlands, two of the leading centers for medical education in the 17th century. You're sitting in a cold, stone lecture hall, listening to a professor in his heavy academic robes. The language of instruction is Latin, the universal tongue of scholarship. And the topic for today's lecture is pharmacology, the science of drugs. The professor, a man of immense learning and reputation, is not just talking about herbs and minerals. He is dedicating a significant portion of his lecture to medicines derived from the human body. He speaks of Mummia Egyptiaca, Cranium humanum, and Des Anii hominis human fat with the same dispassionate, scientific gravity as he does willow bark or opium. This is not fringe science. This is not fringe science. This is the core curriculum. The standard medical textbooks of the day. Works like Oswald Kroll's Basilica Chy Michael or Danielsen Ortiz Institution S Medicina E. contain detailed chapters on the preparation and use of human-derived remedies. These were the books you, as a medical student, were required to study and master. The lecture hall itself might be part of an anatomical theater, a new and revolutionary kind of teaching space. In the center of a steep, tiered circular room is a marble slab. Once a week, the body of an executed criminal would be brought here for a public dissection. The professor of anatomy would meticulously dissect the body, revealing the wonders of God's creation to the assembled students and paying public. This act, the scientific exploration of the dead, created an atmosphere where the human body was increasingly seen as a biological machine, a collection of parts to be studied, understood, and by extension utilized. In the pharmacology lecture, the professor wouldn't just be listing remedies. He would be engaging in the fierce academic debates of the time. This is where the real intellectual action was. The core question for these scholars was rarely, should we be doing this? But rather, what is the correct way to do this? One fierce and ongoing debate revolved around the very nature of Mummia's power. The traditionalists, the followers of Galen, would argue that its efficacy came from its balsamic quality, the perfect balance of humors imparted by the ancient spices and resins. They focused on the substance itself. A new and rising school of thought, the followers of Paracelsus and the aerochemists, would scoff at this. They argued that the power was not in the crude substance, but in its arcanum, a hidden, vital principle that could only be released through chemical processes like distillation. The professor might hold up two vials. Gentlemen, he'd announce in Latin, in this vial, we have the powdered mumia of the ancients, prepared according to the methods of Avicenna. In this one, we have the essentia mumia e, a spirit I myself have distilled from the same source. The Galenists will tell you the powder is superior. We moderns know that the true virtue lies in the purified essence. This wasn't a debate about morality, it was a debate about methodology, about whether the future of medicine lay in ancient pharmacy or modern chemistry. Another bizarrely specific academic argument centered on the skull. Was it the substance of the bone itself that was effective, or was it the form? Some argued that the powder worked because it contained certain vital salts. Others proposed a more metaphysical explanation: the skull, being a sphere, a perfect form, had a natural sympathy with the head and could impose its order upon a disordered brain. Still others, as we've seen, believed the power came from the spirit of the person who had died. These were the subjects of doctoral dissertations and heated intellectual correspondence between the great minds of Europe. Historians today are still trying to understand the intellectual framework of these debates. It's easy for us to dismiss it all as superstitious nonsense, but that would be a mistake. These were brilliant, highly educated men working within the scientific paradigms available to them. Their world was one in which alchemy, astrology, and theology were not separate from medicine but deeply intertwined with it. They were trying to build a rational, systematic understanding of the world, but their rationality was built on a foundation of axioms like the existence of vital spirits and cosmic sympathies that we no longer accept. Their intense debates were a sign of a vibrant, if profoundly misguided, intellectual culture. As the lecture ends, you file out of the hall with your fellow students, your head full of arcanomindescencies. You might stop by the university's botanical garden, where they grow medicinal herbs, but right next to it might be the anatomy building, where the source of your other medicines is being prepared. For you, as a student of the highest form of learning, there is no contradiction. It is all part of one grand, complex, and sometimes terrifying system of knowledge about the human body and its place in the cosmos. As a student navigating these heady academic debates, you can't help but notice one name that comes up again and again, often spoken with a mixture of reverence and contempt: Paracelsus. He's been dead for over a century, but his ghost still haunts every lecture hall and apothecary shop. He is the great disruptor, the revolutionary figure who both criticized and, in a way, supercharged the world of corpse medicine. To understand the evolution of this practice, you have to understand Paracelsus. Born Theophrastus von Hohenheim, he gave himself the name Paracelsus, meaning beyond Celsus, a famous Roman encyclopedist, to signify that he was superior to the ancient authorities. He was an arrogant, brilliant, and deeply controversial Swiss physician, alchemist, and philosopher. He publicly burned the books of Avicenna and Galen, the foundational texts of medicine, for 1,000 years, declaring the dawn of a new era. At first glance, Paracelsus seems like a voice of reason. He was one of the most vociferous critics of the traditional mumia trade. He traveled extensively and, like Ambroise Père, saw with his own eyes the fraudulent nature of the business. He scoffed at the idea of eating ground-up, tar-soaked Egyptian bodies. He wrote scathingly that it was not only useless but harmful, and that such a loathsome thing would be abhorred by any of us in our food. He called those who used it vampires and cannibals. So far, so good. He sounds like a modern man, a skeptic clearing away the cobwebs of superstition. But Paracelsus was no modern man. He didn't want to end corpse medicine, he wanted to reinvent it. He wanted to perfect it. His objection wasn't to the use of human remains, but to the crude and disgusting way they were being used. He was an alchemist, and he believed that the goal of medicine was not to balance humors, but to separate the pure from the impure through chemical processes. This is the core of the Paracelsian revolution in medicine. He believed that everything in nature, plant, mineral, or person had a virtue or an arcanum, a hidden, potent essence. The job of the physician-alchemist was to isolate this essence. Simply grinding up a body and eating it was, to him, like eating a whole grapevine, leaves, dirt and all, when what you really want is the refined spirit of the wine. So, he proposed a new true mumia. His recipes, which we've touched upon, were the height of alchemical weirdness. He advocated for using the bodies of young, healthy men who had died violently, not because he was ghoulish, but because he believed their vital force was still intact. But he didn't want you to eat them. He wanted you to distill them. His true mumia was a tincture, an essence, a purified liquid extracted from the flesh and blood through complex alchemical processes. This, he argued, was a pure, powerful, and clean medicine, free from the dregs and filth of the corpse itself. It was cannibalism, but refined, scientific, and hygienic. One of his strangest and most influential ideas was the concept of the mumia of the microcosm. Paracelsus believed that the human body, the microcosm, was a small-scale reflection of the universe, the macrocosmist. He taught that a powerful medicine could be created from the bodily excretions of a living person, blood, urine, hair, because these things contained the person's unique astral signature. A healthy person's mumia could be used to heal a sick person. The source of the magic wasn't just in the dead anymore, it was in the living. This concept leads directly to a bizarre offshoot of his philosophy that historians find both fascinating and perplexing: the homunculus. Paracelsus and his followers believed, based on the idea of the microcosm's power, that it was theoretically possible to grow a tiny, artificial human being in a jar using human sperm, blood, and an alchemical furnace. While there's no evidence anyone ever succeeded, the fact that it was considered a serious theoretical possibility shows how far his ideas about the inherent power of human substances went. The legacy of Paracelsus is a tangled one, and historians still debate his true impact. Was he a charlatan who just replaced one set of magical beliefs with another, more complicated one? Or was he a genuine pioneer who, despite being wrong about almost everything, helped shift medicine from a tradition based on ancient texts to one based on chemical experimentation? The answer is probably both. He introduced the idea of dose-specific chemical drugs. He famously said, "The dose makes the poison," which is a cornerstone of modern pharmacology. But he did so in the service of creating tinctures from skulls and distilling the essence of hanged men. As a student in this world, you are caught between the old guard and the new. The traditional Galenists in the faculty despise Paracelsus and his followers. The IAT are alchemists. They see them as dangerous, arrogant upstarts. The Paracelsianists, in turn, see the Galenists as dusty old fools clinging to an obsolete system. The corpse in the center of the debate remains the same, but the arguments about how to use it have become a proxy war for the very soul of medicine. Paracelsus didn't banish the ghost from the machine, he just tried to put it in a bottle. Years pass. You are no longer a student, but a man of middle age. The world around you is changing in slow, almost imperceptible ways. The fierce debates between the Galenists and the Paracelsianists that once seemed so urgent in the university halls now feel. A new wind is blowing across Europe, a philosophical movement that will eventually be called the Enlightenment. It carries with it a new way of thinking, a lumen or light of reason that begins to penetrate the darkest, dustiest corners of medicine. This isn't a sudden revolution, but a gradual erosion of the old certainties. The foundations of the world that made corpse medicine logical are slowly being chipped away. One of the first pillars to wobble is the one that rests on ancient authority. Thinkers like René Descartes are encouraging a radical skepticism, urging people to doubt everything and to build knowledge from the ground up based on rational deduction. I think, therefore I am. In England, the Royal Society, with its motto nullius in verba, take nobody's word for it, champions a new kind of science based on empirical evidence, observation, and repeatable experiments. Suddenly, saying Galen said so or Paracelsus taught this is no longer enough. The new question is, what is the evidence? Can you demonstrate it? In this new intellectual climate, the theories behind corpse medicine start to look flimsy. The concept of the four humors, which had been the bedrock of medicine for nearly 2 millennia, begins to crumble. New anatomical discoveries, made possible by more frequent and meticulous dissections, reveal a far more complex human body. William Harvey's demonstration of the circulation of the blood in 1628 was a critical blow. The blood wasn't just a static humor sloshing around, it was a fluid in constant, directed motion, pumped by a mechanical heart. This mechanical view of the body had little room for mystical vital spirits or balsamic properties. As the 17th century gives way to the 18th, this new science gathers momentum. With the invention of the microscope, scientists like Antony van Leeuwenhoek begin to discover a whole new, invisible world of animalcules microorganisms. While the full germ theory of disease is still a long way off, the idea that sickness might be caused by tiny, external invaders rather than an internal imbalance of fluids begins to take root. This presents a powerful new paradigm that has no need for powdered mummies or skull tinctures. You can see this shift happening in your own life. Your new university-trained physician talks less about your humors and more about your fibers and nerves. He might diagnose you with having tense fibers or weak nervous fluid. The language is changing, becoming more mechanical and less mystical. Like quinine for fever or foxglove digitalis for heart conditions. A weird transitional detail from this period is the medical machinery fad. Some doctors, inspired by the new mechanical philosophy, develop bizarre contraptions to treat patients, like spinning chairs to rebalance the fluids in the brain of a mentally ill person. It was a strange halfway house between the old magical thinking and a new, almost naively mechanistic view of the body. Of course, the old ways die hard. The trade in mummy and skulls doesn't just vanish overnight. It continues as fashionable circles and as a form of folk medicine. But it loses its intellectual respectability. By the mid-18th century, you'd be hard-pressed to find a professor at a top university seriously lecturing on the virtues of cranium humanum. It's becoming an embarrassment, a relic of a superstitious, Gothic past that the new men of reason are eager to leave behind. The decline of corpse medicine is a topic that medical historians are still actively researching. Was it driven primarily by the rise of new scientific theories, or were changing social and cultural sensibilities more important? Some argue that as society became more civilized and refined in the Age of Enlightenment, the raw, visceral nature of these remedies simply became distasteful. Cannibalism, even in a powdered form, was no longer something a respectable person wanted to be associated with. The aesthetics of the cure started to matter as much as its supposed efficacy. It's likely a combination of both. Science provided the intellectual ammunition, and changing taste provided the social pressure to abandon the practice. You find yourself caught in the middle of this transition. You still have the old remedies in your cabinet, but you feel a little sheepish about them. They remind you of a past that is rapidly receding. The new science is exciting, full of promise and elegant logic, but a part that remembers the terror of your youthful illness and the comfort that the strange, dusty powder brought you, feels a small sense of loss. The world is becoming more rational, more understandable, and perhaps a little less enchanted. The ghosts are being exorcised from the machine of the body, replaced by cogs, pipes, and fluids. The world of your old age is a very different place from the world of your youth. The talk in the coffee houses is of reason, rights, and revolution. Science is celebrated, superstition mocked, and the medical practices that were once the height of sophistication are now becoming a public joke. The final nail in the coffin of corpse medicine isn't a scientific paper, it's a punchline. You see this transformation happening on the London stage. You go to the theatre to see a new comedy, a sharp, witty play by a fashionable playwright. The plot involves a foolish hypochondriac nobleman who is being swindled by a charlatan doctor. In one scene, the doctor, a fast-talking rogue, tries to sell the nobleman an incredibly expensive powder. He whispers that it's the essence of the band king, guaranteed to restore youth and vigor. The nobleman, wide-eyed, is about to pay a fortune for it when the clever servant girl reveals that the essence is nothing but brick dust mixed with soot from the chimney. The audience roars with laughter. This is a new phenomenon. For centuries, these remedies were treated with deadly seriousness. Now, they are comic props. They are symbols of foolishness, gullibility, and an old-fashioned ignorance that the modern, enlightened audience can feel superior to. The transition of corpse medicine from tragedy to farce is a key indicator of its social death. Satirists and writers of the Enlightenment were merciless. Voltaire, the great French philosopher and wit, might have written a scathing entry in his philosophical dictionary about the absurdity of Christians who believe in the resurrection of the body, cheerfully eating their fellow men for a headache. In England, the new, popular magazines like The Spectator or The Tatler would publish satirical essays mocking the superstitions of the previous generation. holding up the belief in skull moss and mummy powder as prime examples of Gothic barbarism. You can see this shift in art as well. Remember the merchant's prized mummy brown painting? The new generation of artists, the neoclassicists, reject those dark, murky, mysterious palettes. They favor clear lines, bright light, unrational compositions, drawing inspiration from the perceived order and harmony of classical Greece and Rome. Mummy brown, with its grim origins and shadowy tones, starts to fall out of fashion. It's seen as a relic of a darker, more morbid and less rational age of painting. A particularly strange survival of the practice, even as it was being mocked, was in the world of quackery. As mainstream medicine abandoned these remedies, they were eagerly adopted by traveling quacksalvers and charlatans who preyed on the rural and the desperate. These flamboyant figures would set up stalls at country fairs, selling the true king's drops, now a cheap imitation made with animal bones and alcohol, or a secret Egyptian salve made of pig lard and dirt. They kept the language and the mystique of the old remedies alive, but stripped of any academic or theological justification. It was purely a marketing gimmick, preying on a folk memory of a time when these things were believed to be powerful. This retreat into the world of farce and fraud raises an interesting question for historians of popular culture. How long does a belief persist after it has been debunked by the elite? The answer is a very long time. While the educated classes in London and Paris were laughing at plays mocking Mumia, there were likely still people in remote villages in the Alps or the Pyrenees who genuinely believed in the power of hangman's fat. The death of the belief system was not a single event, but a slow, uneven process of cultural change that happened at different speeds in different places. You, as an educated man of your time, are in on the joke. You chuckle along with the rest of the theater audience. You shake your head in amused disbelief when you read a satirical pamphlet. You feel modern, enlightened, and rational. You left the darkness behind, but later that night, as you're getting ready for bed, you might catch a glimpse of yourself in the mirror. You remember the taste of the Mumia wine, the strange, dusty, spicy flavor. You remember the cold, smooth feel of the quart of hangman's salve. You remember the sincere, unwavering belief you once had that these things were saving your life. The laughter from the theater echoes in your ears, but it has a hollow ring to it. It's easy to laugh at the past from the safety of the present, but you were there. You lived in that world. And you know, in a way the young playwright never could, that the line between a sacred cure and a ridiculous joke is sometimes just a matter of what century you happen to be born in. Decades have passed. You are an old man now, living in a world that would be almost unrecognizable to your younger self. The air in London is thick with the smoke of a burgeoning industrial age. The talk is of steam power, factories, and political reform. The medical world you once knew, with its humors and vital spirits, feels like a distant, half-remembered dream. Your own grandchildren view your stories of corpse medicine with the same wide-eyed disbelief they reserve for fairy tales about dragons and giants. One day, driven by a strange sense of nostalgia, you decide to take a walk through one of the city's older, more forgotten neighborhoods. You find yourself in a narrow, cobblestone lane, a place that time seems to have overlooked. And there, tucked between a grimy print shop and a tavern, you see it, an apothecary shop, not one of the new, bright chemist shops with their gleaming glass and polished mahogany, but a proper old apothecary, its windows thick with dust, its sign faded and peeling. On a whim you push open the door. The familiar scent hits you like a physical blow, a ghost from your past, that unique, overwhelming mixture of dried herbs, sweet resins, and something else, the faint, dusty, earthy smell of the old remedies. The man behind the counter is as old as you are, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his hands stained with the potions of a lifetime. He looks up at you with eyes that have seen the world change. You strike up a conversation to old men reminiscing about a world that no longer exists. You ask him, half jokingly, if he still stocks the old-fashioned cures. He doesn't laugh. He gestures with a thumb towards a dark corner of the shop, to a set of drawers at the very bottom of a dusty shelving unit. For the old customers, he says quietly, and for those the new doctors can't help. They always come back to the old ways when they're desperate enough. He tells you that he still gets requests, maybe once or twice a year, for a pinch of cranium powder. An old woman whose grandson suffers from fits. A sailor who wants a styptic powder he can trust more than the new chemical styptic S. He complains that the quality is not what it used to be. He shares a weirdly specific trade secret, a piece of forgotten lore. You can't get good skull moss anymore, he grumbles. Not since they stopped leaving the bodies on the gibbetess. The moss needs the sun and the rain on the bone. The new stuff, scraped from old churchyard skulls. It has no virtue. He is, in a sense, a living fossil. He is the last guardian of a dying tradition, a man whose skills and knowledge, once considered the height of a learned profession, are now obsolete. He complains about the new doctors with their stethoscopes and their obsession with germs, a ridiculous, invisible fancy, in his opinion. They look at the body like it's a machine, a clock to be wound, he says, shaking his head. They've forgotten the spirit. They've forgotten the sympathies. This encounter highlights a fascinating point that historians of medicine often grapple with: the persistence of unofficial medicine. While our medical establishment and the educated elite moved on, the old beliefs didn't just disappear. They went underground, surviving in the practices of folk healers, in the back rooms of old shops like this one, and in the collective memory of the community. These last practitioners were the final, living link in a chain of knowledge that stretched back through Paracelsicism, the Galen mists, all the way to the ancient world. The old apothecary might even confess that most of what he sells now is a pale imitation. The mumia he has in a dusty jar is probably just a mixture of asphalt and animal bones. He doesn't have the heart to tell his desperate customers the truth. The idea of the cure is what they are buying, the memory of its power. You listen to him talk, and you feel a profound sense of melancholy. This man is not a charlatan or a ghoul. He's a craftsman whose craft has been rendered obsolete by the relentless march of time. He genuinely believes in the world he is describing, a world of cosmic sympathies and vital spirits, a world where the substance of a dead man could bring life to a sick one. His shop is not just a store, it's a museum of a lost belief system. You thank him for his time and step back out into the noisy, bustling street. The world of steam and iron feels loud, aggressive, and soulless compared to the quiet, dusty, enchanted world you just left. You realize that what has been lost is not just a set of bizarre remedies, but a whole way of seeing the world. A world where the boundaries between life and death, body and soul, magic and medicine were a percent negotiable. A world where a human being was more than just a machine, and where even in death they could still hold the power to heal. The encounter with the old apothecary stays with you. It makes you think about the final chapter in this long, strange story: what happened to the mummies themselves. For centuries, they were a commodity, a raw material, a drug. But as their medicinal and artistic uses faded into obscurity, they didn't just disappear. They underwent one last, dramatic transformation. They became artifacts. Your grandson, a curious young man with an interest in the new sciences of archaeology and history, comes to you one day, his eyes wide with excitement. He's just returned from the British Museum. He tells you about the magnificent new Egyptian galleries, where, for the first time, the public can gaze upon the wonders of the ancient Nile. And the centerpiece of the collection, he says, is a real Egyptian sarcophagus, complete with its original, linen-wrapped inhabitant. You decide to go and see for yourself. The museum is a grand, imposing building, a temple to the new religion of science and empire. You walk through halls filled with Greek statues and Roman coins. And then you enter the Egyptian court. The air is still and hushed. In the center of the room, under a glass case, lies a sarcophagus, its hieroglyphs telling the story of a priest who is the mummy itself. The crowd around the display is a mix of awe, revulsion, and intense curiosity. People press their faces to the glass, whispering amongst themselves. They see an object of immense historical significance, a window into a lost civilization. They see a scientific specimen, a body that can teach them about ancient diets, diseases, and burial practices. You, however, see something else. You see a medicine cabinet. You look at the dry, brittle body, and you don't see a priest named Cannibal. You see the raw material for the king's drops. You see the origin of a pigment on a painter's palette. To everyone else in this room, this body is a relic of the distant past. To you, it's a relic of your past, of your own lifetime. The thought is dizzying. The very same object that your doctor would have prescribed to be ground up and eaten is now being preserved with the utmost care, studied by scholars, and gazed upon by the public as a priceless treasure. This shift in perspective is profound. The mummy has been successfully demedicalized and resacralized, but in a new, secular way. Its value no longer lies in its supposed ability to heal the body, but in its ability to educate the mind and stir the imagination. It is no longer a consumable, but an object of contemplation. The science of medicine has been replaced by the science of history. A bizarre and popular phenomenon of the 19th century that perfectly captures this transition was the mummy unwrapping party. Wealthy collectors who had acquired a mummy on their travels in Egypt would invite friends to their homes for a special evening's entertainment. After dinner, the host, often with the help of a surgeon or an antiquarian, would proceed to publicly unroll the mummy's linen bandages, revealing the body layer by layer. It was a thrilling, macabre piece of theatre, a blend of scientific inquiry and drawing room sensationalism. As each layer was removed, trinkets and amulets might be discovered, which would be passed around for the guests to admire. The final reveal of the desiccated face was the climax of the evening. This practice sits at a fascinating and ethically dubious intersection that historians still analyze. It was, on the one hand, a genuine, if amateur, attempt at archaeological investigation. On the other hand, it was the ultimate objectification of a human body, turning a person's final resting place into after-dinner entertainment. It represents the mummy in limbo, no longer a sacred object of religious veneration, and not yet a fully protected subject of scientific ethics, but a curiosity, an object of wonder and morbid fascination. As you stand in the quiet of the museum, you think about the long journey this body has taken. From a sacred tomb on the Nile to a smuggler's ship to the back room of a London apothecary, and now finally, to rest under the glass of a museum display. It has been, at various times, a vessel for a soul, a source of medicine, a pigment for paint, and a party favor. You look at the faces of the people around you. Their expressions of detached, scientific curiosity. They see an object. You see a story. You see the ghost of a world where the dead were not just remembered but consumed in the desperate, eternal, and deeply human search for a cure. The final irony is that the mummy, by becoming a museum piece, has at last achieved a kind of immortality, just not the one its original embalmers, or its later medical consumers, ever intended. You walk home from the museum, the image of the mummy under glass seared into your mind. The city streets, with their gas lamps beginning to flicker on in the twilight, feel like a different planet from the world that mummy once inhabited and from the world where you once consumed its brethren. It all seems so definitively over, a closed chapter in a book of ancient superstitions. But is it? As you settle into your armchair, your mind drifts to the strange ways that these old beliefs refuse to die completely. They fade, they go underground, they change their shape, but they never quite vanish. They leave echoes, weird resonances that reverberate into the modern age in ways people don't even recognize. Think about language. The word mummy itself carries the weight of this history. When a child today uses the word, they mean a monster from a horror film, a creature that lurches from its tomb. This image of the malevolent, reanimated mummy is largely a creation of 19th and 20th century fiction, a Gothic fantasy. But this fantasy is, in a way, a darking version of the old medical belief. For centuries, the mummy was seen as a source of life, something to be consumed for healing. The horror story reimagines it as a source of death, a creature that consumes the living. The auras are opposite, but the central idea of the mummy as a vessel of supernatural power remains. Then there are the more direct survivals in folk medicine. Corpse medicine, in its most overt forms, retreated from the cities and the educated classes, but it lingered in the countryside for a surprisingly long time. Well into the 19th century, and in some isolated areas even into the early 20th, you could still find folk healers quietly recommending remedies that would have been familiar to your 17th century apothecary. In rural Ireland, There were reports of people using dust from a churchyard skull to cure epilepsy. In parts of Germany, hangman's fat was still being sold as a secret cure for rheumatism. These practices became whispers, old wives' tales, things people did but didn't openly admit to. A particularly weird and specific echo can be found in the world of folk magic and charms. The Hand of Glory is a prime example. This was the preserved and pickled hand of a hanged man, which, when a candle made from the same man's fat was placed in it, was believed to have the power to render the inhabitants of a house unconscious, allowing thieves to burgle it without being discovered. Stories and grimoires detailing how to make one were popular in the 17th and 18th centuries. While the belief waned, the story of the Hand of Glory became a staple of Gothic folklore, a creepy tale to tell by the fire, its origins in the very real trade of execution as body parts forgotten by most. This persistence raises a difficult question for historians and folklorists: where is the line between a living medical practice and a dead superstition? When a belief is no longer endorsed by doctors but is still practiced by a few, has it died? The process is more like a slow fossilization. The belief loses its living, breathing function as medicine, but its shape is preserved in the stone of folklore, language, and scary stories. And sometimes, the echo is less direct, more thematic. You pick up a newspaper and read an advertisement for a new patent medicine. Barton's Miraculous, full of bold claims and glowing testimonials. It promises to restore youthful vigor, cure nervous disorders, and purify the blood. It contains the adhints, a secret, exotic ingredient sourced from a faraway land. Is this so different from the sales pitch from Amir? The language is updated, the ingredients are now rare botanicals instead of powdered furrows, but the underlying promise is identical. It speaks to the same deep human fears of sickness and aging, and the same hope for a single, magical cure. The snake oil salesman of the 19th century is the direct descendant of the apothecary who sold you your first dose of Mumia. The product has changed, but the marketing and the psychology it preys upon has not. You realize that this story isn't a straight line from A to B, from superstition to science. It's a messy, tangled web. The old ways were not simply vanquished, they were absorbed, transformed, and repurposed. They hide in the shadows of our modern world, in our ghost stories, in our turns of phrase, in the very structure of our desperate hopes for a miracle cure. The cannibal cure is dead, but its ghost is all around you, a faint, rattling echo in the machinery of the new age. You're sitting by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls of your quiet room. The journey is almost over. You've traveled from your sickbed to the apothecary, from the king's lab to the executioner's block, from the artist's studio to the halls of the university, and finally to the sterile quiet of the museum. You have seen the dead transformed from sacred vessels to medicine, to art, to artifact. You've witnessed the birth, life, and slow, strange death of one of history's most bizarre ideas. Now, in the quiet of your final years, it's time for one last reflection. It's easy to look back on this entire chapter of history with a sense of detached amusement or outright disgust. Cannibals, ghouls, superstitious fools. It's comforting to draw a thick, black line between then and now, to reassure ourselves that we are rational, scientific, and civilized. And they were not. But are we really so different? Let's strip away the exotic details, the skulls, the mummies, the gallows. What was the fundamental belief at the heart of it all? It was the idea that you consume a substance to gain its properties. It was the belief that by ingesting the vitality of another, you could enhance your own. It was a desperate search for a shortcut to health, a magical fix for the terrifying frailties of the human body. Now look at our own world. Think of the modern wellness industry, a multi-billion-dollar global enterprise. We don't eat powdered pharaohs, but we consume expensive supplements and superfoods from exotic locations, convinced that acai berries from the Himalayas hold the secret to longevity. The story of an ancient, secret wisdom from a fire whale, and is still one of the most powerful marketing tools in existence. We don't drink the blood of the young for epilepsy, but the quest for youth and vitality has led to a booming industry of hormone replacement therapies. Transfusions of young blood are practiced with dubious scientific backing that is eerily reminiscent of the old beliefs, and a near-religious devotion to collagen powders, hoping to literally consume the substance of youth to replenish our own. The core magical thinking is still there. We don't believe in vital spirits anymore. We talk about antioxidants, bioavalanche, and cellular rejuvenation. We've swapped our vocabulary, replacing the language of alchemy with the language of biochemistry, but the underlying psychological impulse is strikingly similar. We want to find that one special thing, that pill, that powder, that diet that will protect us from decay and death. A bizarre modern parallel that historians of the future might find fascinating is the practice of post-operative consuming the placenta after childbirth. Proponents claim it can boost energy, balance hormones, and increase milk supply, echoing the old Paracelsian idea of using the body's own microscopic substances for healing. While it's a fringe practice, its existence shows that the idea of recycling the body's own product for medicinal benefit is not just an ancient curiosity. Of course, there are immense differences. Our modern practices are usually built on a foundation of scientific inquiry, however shaky it may be in the wellness space. We have randomized controlled trials, peer review, and a deep understanding of biology that our ancestors lacked. We are not harvesting the bodies of the executed. But the debate about where to draw the line between legitimate science is as fierce today as the debates between the Galenists and Paracelsians. For every well-tested medical intervention, there is a universe of alternative therapies, nutritional supplements, and wellness fads, all promising a miracle. The modern apothecary is not a dusty shop but a brightly lit health food store or an endless online marketplace. But the fundamental transaction is the same, selling hope in a bottle. So, as you close your eyes, you see that the story isn't really about them. It's about us. It's a story about human nature. It's about our relationship with our own mortality. The ghoulishness of corpse medicine makes it easy to dismiss, but it also is a powerful, distorted mirror. In its reflection, we can see our own anxieties, our own desperate hopes, and our own eternal, unwavering belief that somewhere out there, there's a cure for the simple, terrifying fact of being human. The methods change, the ingredients change, but the hunger remains. And so the fire in your hearth burns low, its once roaring flames now just a gentle, pulsating glow of embers. The shadows on the wall have stopped their frantic dancing and have settled into long, soft shapes that blur the corners of the room. The story is over. The journey is done. You can feel the weight of sleep, a gentle, welcome pressure behind your eyes. Let your mind drift away from the jarring thoughts of then on now. Let the details of the story, the dusty powders, the dark tinctures, the flickering candles in ancient tombs all dissolve and melt away, like sugar in warm water. They are just echoes now, fading whispers in the quiet of your mind. Feel the world around you simplify. Become aware of the soft weight of the blanket over you, the gentle pressure of the pillow beneath your head. The sounds of the world outside have faded into a distant, muffled hum, a gentle lullaby sung by the sleeping city. There is only the quiet rhythm of your own breathing, a slow and steady tide in and out. You are floating now in that peaceful, weightless space between wakefulness and dream. The past is a landscape you are drifting away from, its strange and jagged peaks shrinking on the horizon. Ahead of you lies the soft, dark, open country of sleep. There are no questions there, no debates, no anxieties. There is only rest. There is only rest. There is only stillness. The long day is over, and the quiet of the night is here to hold you. Let go. Drift. The end of the article. Good night.